These protests are really quite unprecedented. What's driving them?
Well, hardship. I think economic hardship is the main thing that's driving them. So Cuba has suffered, obviously, like the rest of the Caribbean, from losing all its tourists because of COVID. But on top of that, it was already suffering from the tightening of sanctions by the Trump administration. And they haven't actually been lifted by the Biden administration. And in fact, they're tighter now this year than they've ever been. So the Cuban economy is in serious trouble. And so people's frustrations have boiled over.
So is it fair for the president to be blaming the US sanctions? As you say, they're tighter now than ever before. How much has that crippled the economy?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, the Cubans are fed up with hearing this because the sanctions have been there for 60 years and the government's often blamed the sanctions for any troubles that they've had. But actually this time, the sanctions are tighter than ever. And so, that on top of the COVID means that the government's room for maneuver in actually trying to improve the life of Cubans is very, very tight. They can't do international transactions because of the way that the US putting Cuba on the list of state sponsors of terrorism has scared international banks, international companies from doing any business with Cuba. So Cuba is in a really difficult place economically.
Of course, people, because it is a socialist, a communist country, they are used to a social system of being provided for, however minimally. Is that still happening in some form?
Well, the government is trying to do that. It says that it's protecting the vulnerable. It's still got a social security system. It still has basic foodstuffs. But that's all. And what's happened since the last time they had demonstrations, which was in the 1990s, is that there's a much larger private sector now. And it was very much linked to the tourism industry. And so those people now in the private sector and the informal sector that used to be able to make a living out of that now have nothing. And so they're entirely dependent on the dwindling value of what the state can give them.
Is there a protest too against the president because, he's new, he's a different kind of president? It's not the usual Castro regime that has been continued for so many, many years.
Well, that's interesting because the Castros, of course, had their historical role, their role in the revolution, heroic figures and so on. And DiazCanel is just another Cuban. He's a technocrat. He's a manager. And so what he's been trying to do since he's been in is actually, decentralize and share decision-making with more people and involve more people in the discussions and so on. Of course, during COVID, having people involved in discussions is very difficult because you can't have meetings. But, he's been trying to be open, but at the same time as he's stressing continuity with the previous regime and so on. And so it's not really worked, or at least clearly it hasn't worked. People don't feel that they're involved and they don't feel that he's doing enough. And he doesn't have the kudos that the Castros had. So he's got a very difficult job.
At the same time, he's called on his own supporters to counter the protests. He's cracked down with the military. Is there a chance that these protests will continue? That is not necessarily letting voices be heard by stomping on these protests?
I think what he's trying to do is to demonstrate that there's still a lot of support for the government and rejection of international interference. So he's trying to present the demonstrations as international interference. And that has obviously been what the Cuban government could use for many years because, of course, the US describes Cuba as an enemy state and it's trying to sabotage its economy the whole time. And so, it carries some weight, but it's not, obviously with those people, it's not carrying enough weight. But he's hoping that his supporters, the nationalist rejection of international interference, will be sufficient to demonstrate to those people that they're a minority. But, it's a difficult one to do, and it's interesting to see which way it goes. I mean, he's trying not to clamp down or to react in a violent way, clearly. But, he is facing people who are turning cars upside down and using rocks and so on. And so it is becoming quite difficult to contain.
What is your sense of what sort of priority Cuba is going to be for the Biden administration?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, this year, the Biden administration for the first 6 months have been saying Cuba isn't top on our list. It's not a high priority. We'll come to it one day. The election campaign, they said that they were going to revert to Obama's position, but they haven't done. And actually, by neglecting the issue, they've done themselves a great disservice, I think, in terms of The trust, or the potential trust that was built up, that could have been restored, has been lost. So now negotiating with the Cuban government is going to be very, very difficult. So they've got a much more difficult situation that they're trying to deal with in Cuba through neglect of the issue, basically.